Thanks very much. Good evening. I first wanted to essentially concur with everything that Robin said, and I think it's interesting that we've talked about climate and water together, because in some ways, I think there's been a lot of learning from the climate debate that's fed into the water debate. If you look back in the early 90s at how, and even the 80s, at how NGOs were challenging companies, challenging government, challenging all of us on the fact that climate change was happening and we needed to respond. I think it's fair to say there was a lag time with companies getting to grips with that, thinking it through, and starting to respond. And I think we've learned from that. And on water, I think you see quite a different picture. You see companies and NGOs and others together learning and exploring about how this resource crisis will challenge us, what the shared risks are, and how we can respond together. And so, in a sense, the conversation that you'll be part of tonight is a conversation that's very much ongoing at the moment. I'm going to talk about our corporate water work, our water footprint. We're the first company to have published a full footprint of our product. But it's a thing we only launched in August a couple of months ago at the Stockholm Water Week, and it's a very part of a live conversation that we're having with organizations like WWF through convening forums such as the CEO Water Mandate, which is part of the UN Global Compact, and another network called the Water Footprint Network, which both WWF and SABMiller were founder members of. And so this is very much a live debate, and I hope this evening that we'll get right into that debate and have a good discussion. SABMiller is a global brewer. We actually came out of South African origins. We're a proudly African-originated multinational. We now brew beer and bottle soft drinks, and occasionally produce bottled water in about 30 markets where we have operational control, and a further 30 joint ventures. And we operate originally in Africa, then into Central and Eastern Europe, in South America, in the US, and now in India, China, and other parts of the world as well. So we have a global approach. And what I want to do is talk about how we are practically managing, trying to understand and then practically manage the challenge of water for a business like ourselves. Now, water sits in our sustainable development approach, which is my job in the business to lead, and it's one of our 10 sustainable development priorities. And I just wanted to flag that through those, we think we've captured the key issues that a business like SABMiller needs to respond to and manage to be a responsible business. Clearly, you can see right at the top there, to discourage irresponsible drinking, because one of our core products is beer. And then through other environmental issues, through to some more social issues, as you'd expect. And I'm only going to talk about water today, but there's a lot of information about each of those on our website, and I encourage you to take a look. You can also, on our website, see the scores for each country around the world in terms of how they perform in our business on each of these issues. See where we perform well, where we have some challenges, and there's a very open discussion about that on our website. The other thing about sustainable development is that if it doesn't really impact your core business, if what I do doesn't really impact the way that our general managers or our salespeople operate around the world, then there's not much point doing it. And so for SABMiller, it's very much about understanding how issues like water scarcity can impact our core business and how we can plan to respond to those. And even though we're a big business, we cannot do that on our own, because water is an issue that goes across boundaries, as Robin's talked about. And therefore, we need to develop partnerships to manage. You've seen a version of this already from Robin. It tells you water availability and then water scarcity risks in different parts of the world. And we've used thinking like this to understand what our risk in different parts of the world might be. We've used a tool from a group called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's free on their website, wbcsd.org, and you can plug in the GPS location of any place around the world and plug in the expectations of population growth or industry growth or other things, climate change, and they get an expectation of what that particular area will look like in terms of water scarcity and water challenges over the time period you choose. And so we've used that as the intellectual basis for how much of a challenge we think we have on water scarcity and how we need to respond to it. And you can also go and download that and test it. And this is our response. It's what we call our 5R model of water management. Although if you're sharp, you notice the one on the left is a P, but R is the second letter. But in the middle, what we wanted to do was to make sure we challenged ourselves to become as efficient as we could in our water use. Now, clearly, brewing beer, bottling soft drinks takes a significant amount of water. It takes, in our breweries at the moment, about 4.5 liters of water to make 1 liter of beer. That's better than the industry average, but we need to go further. And so our goal for that central bit, to reduce, reuse, and recycle within our own operations, is to become 25% more water efficient by 2015. And we're going to do that, and we're making progress against that, and we're investing a lot of resource and human capital in tackling that. But actually, the more challenging risk for our business is to look upstream, to the piece that we call protect, which is to understand how water resources will change for the watersheds that we draw water from to brew beer, or the water that our farmers would use to grow the crops that we would then buy from them. And downstream, there's a whole piece around redistribution. In areas of the world where there are communities without access to clean water, how can we support that process? And in some of the places in the world that we operate, for example, we've recently built a brewery in southern Sudan. Actually, that's a pretty critical piece of local water supply for people. But I want to, most of all, to focus on the upstream part in terms of water protection, and you'll see why in a moment. So we did a water footprint, and I'll show you the report in a second, but you can get it from our website. And it looks at the water use throughout the value chain. So not just in a brewery or a bottling plant for SABMiller, but all the way upstream to the crops that are grown that we would buy, and the inputs of those crops, like fertilizers, and all the way downstream to a consumer drinking a product and the bottle being washed and reused, as is the case for about half of our product around the world. And for a business looking at sustainable development issues, not just water, but when we look at carbon or when we look at other issues, it's critical nowadays to take that value chain approach, not just to look within your operations, but actually to look across the whole value chain, because it's quite likely that the biggest risk will not actually be in your own plants, it'll be somewhere else. And that's the case with water for us. And so Robin's already talked through the three aspects of water footprinting, but it's quite critical for us. Using this methodology, which was developed at the University of Twente in the Netherlands quite recently, and with some people at WWF innovating it as well, to understand what this means on the ground and what it means practically. And so we undertook a water footprint for two businesses in the last year, in South Africa and in the Czech Republic. We actually did that working with WWF in a very open book way, shared with them all the data. And this is the result for South Africa. And there's the report as well. It takes 155 liters of water to make a liter of beer in South Africa. Now, what does that mean? Is that bad? Is that good? It's actually quite hard to tell. And I've broken it down here in terms of the blue water, which is the irrigated water, stored water from aquifers or from rivers or lakes, and then green water, which is water from soil moisture from rain that's used to grow the crop. And we call this net green, which is the additional amount of rainfall, essentially, or soil moisture used to grow the crop over what would otherwise be there, the other climax vegetation. And so 95% of the total water footprint of a liter of beer is actually in that agricultural phase. Now, 155 liters seems like a lot. In fact, in the Czech Republic, it's quite a lot lower. It's about 45 liters for a liter of beer, and it explains in the report what the differences are. But actually, that number, whilst it's good for raising awareness about how much water is used, it's not necessarily that effective for helping us understand how to manage the challenge. And this is the context. This was in The Economist earlier this year, in February. It's from an institute called the Pacific Institute, very respected for their water research. And I include it partly because actually it shows that number for beer. They've got a generic number. It's not too different from ours. Is actually quite a lot less than some other products. But one of the questions I want to get into when we have a debate later on and a discussion is to say, well, to what extent does this help you as a consumer choose what beverage to buy? To what extent does it help you make a consumption decision or not? And one of the challenges with water, which is a bit different from carbon footprinting, is that in different parts of the world, different products have very different water footprints, depending on what crops you buy to make those products. So, for example, as I've said, in Czech, 45 liters of water for a liter of beer. In South Africa, 155. And beer is generally brewed very locally for local consumption. We have a very small amount of export around the world, but it's largely brewed locally. So the company is part of the local community. And so what does that mean for how community manages water? And actually, if you really want to understand what the risk is to a business in terms of water footprinting and water use, you need to get down right to the level of what crop is grown where and what proportion of the available water resource does it use, and what impact does that have? And this is a diagram of South Africa. South Africa is managed through 19 water management areas by the government. You can see top left from the WBCSD water tool, a detailed water scarcity map of South Africa. And what the challenge for a business is actually to go that next level and to discuss with your suppliers and understand how much water they're using in different parts of your supply chain, and then look at the specific risks. And there are some parts of South Africa where actually crops like barley or maize are irrigated, where actually there's quite a good supply of water. And so it's not such a challenge. But there are other areas where it may be a largely rain-fed crop, but actually it's taking a lot of water out of the total system. And that's where we need to then address and take action. And so we have a couple of projects with WWF in South Africa. One is looking at how we can offset the water use of two breweries that are in water-scarce areas through ensuring water is contained within the watershed through taking away non-indigenous trees. It's a project that the government likes because it creates 30,000 jobs, replaces with indigenous trees, and it is quite well governed and overall has a good impact on the watershed. The second is working more with suppliers to look at how we can develop a sustainable barley farming toolkit, working with WWF. But it's that practical level that we have to get to really make a difference on this issue. I wanted to talk about some of the challenges for a business when we're working with governments, when we're working with NGOs, and I'm sure the challenges are equally the other way as well. Because they're very different types of organizations. And for example, when we're, as a business, planning what we might do on a particular project, an internal project, we typically plan over a month to 3 months, depending on the scale of the project, because we like to move fast and do things quite quickly. But of course, if you want to work with community groups or dialogue with government or work with others, then dialogue takes a lot longer. And if you try and move too fast, you'll rush the process and you won't be able to build trust. And so we're learning through the various water partnerships that we have in different parts of the world that we need to be realistic about the timeframes of how we can manage these. We need to understand the different languages of the NGO community, of donor governments, and of course, of different businesses to have much better dialogues that focus on what we can do together. And an illustration of that are these photographs. On the top is a reverse osmosis plant at our business in Rajasthan, in Rochi's in India. It's a brewery. Probably cost something like $3 million to put that plant in overall. And that treats wastewater to an extremely high standard so we can reuse as much as we can within our own plant. Not into the product, but within the plant generally. And that's a part of the water solution for Rajasthan, which is a water-scarce area. But it's not the total solution. And below, you can see a project we're working on with the Confederation for Indian Industry and with a hydrological group in India, which is looking at how we can build dams and wasteland areas for better natural recharge of water into the same watershed that we're drawing water from to brew the beer. And to do that, bottom photograph takes a lot more effort, a lot more discussion, a lot more community engagement. It means working with local farmers to make sure they're not just going to use water more inefficiently if we're putting more back into the watershed. It's a much more complex discussion, but it's absolutely critical. And sometimes these projects can have very good business cases. And this is an example of something that was actually signed on Sunday in Bogota, last Sunday in Bogota in Colombia, and it's just about to kick off. And it's working with our business there, Bavaria, is working with another NGO called the Nature Conservancy to look at some previously forested land, previously rainforest, in the watershed that supplies Bogota. And the reason that we got involved as a business was because we could see our water prices going up year on year quite significantly. And it was because of the way that the land was being used upstream, where they were cutting down trees, using it for cattle farming. There was a lot of soil, a lot of runoff, a lot of soil got into the river, and it took a lot of money to actually take it out of the water supply, and that got passed on to us as a customer. So we've become part of this broader project. It's going to cost not a huge amount, about $1.5 million a year overall. The Nature Conservancy have set it up. We're putting in $150,000 a year, so 10% of that. And it's estimated it will save about $4.5 million a year for the city of Bogota overall in terms of water treatment costs. And you can see these are obviously doctored photographs because it hasn't happened yet, and the clouds are in the same place. But you can see on the right that, for example, putting hedges back in and reforesting steep slopes are the kind of things that need to happen on the ground. And it's only an area of 20,000 hectares. And what the scheme is doing is paying farmers essentially to manage their land better, incentivizing them to reduce that environmental damage and reduce the water treatment cost. So it's these kind of partnerships, I think, that can make a real difference to managing water more sustainably, to addressing the challenges that Robin's highlighted. But they take time, they take effort, but we as a business are committed to them.